The dust from the stagecoach still hung in the air when Victoria Hayes realized she was the only passenger who had disembarked at the weathered sign that read Alta, Wyoming Territory, in letters so faded they were barely legible against the wood. It was 1878, and the September sun beat down mercilessly on the single dirt road that constituted the town's main thoroughfare, lined with buildings that looked like they were one strong wind away from collapse. Victoria clutched her carpetbag tighter, feeling the weight of every doubt that had plagued her since leaving Philadelphia 3 weeks ago. The letter from her aunt's estate lawyer had been brief and impersonal, informing her that she had inherited a boarding house. But as she looked around at the desolate landscape, she wondered if there had been some terrible mistake. A tumbleweed rolled past her feet as she stood there, the only movement on the empty street. The stagecoach driver had already thrown down her trunk and was climbing back up to his seat, clearly eager to be gone. Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. She had nowhere to go, no money left for passage elsewhere, and no idea which of these tired buildings might be the boarding house she supposedly owned. Her situation back east had been desperate enough to make this journey seem like Providence, but now, standing alone in this forgotten corner of Wyoming, she wondered if she had made a fatal error in judgment. "You looking lost, miss?" The voice came from behind her, not quite a question. Victoria spun around to find a man leaning against the post of what appeared to be a general store, watching her with an expression that was neither friendly nor hostile, just observant. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his work shirt, and his eyes were a striking shade of gray-blue that seemed to see right through her carefully maintained composure. He wore dusty trousers, scuffed boots, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A hat hung down his back from a cord around his neck. "I am looking for someone," Victoria said, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. She would not appear weak, no matter how frightened she felt. "A lawyer named Mr. Caldwell. He was supposed to meet the stage." The man pushed off from the post and walked toward her with an easy, rolling gait that suggested countless hours in the saddle. As he came closer, Victoria could see the lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, and the way his shoulders filled out his shirt. He could not have been much older than she was, perhaps 24 or 25 to her 21 years. "Caldwell died 2 months back," the man said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Heart gave out. If you are here about property, you will want to talk to the marshal. He has been handling the legal matters since then." Victoria felt her knees go weak. Dead. The only contact she had in this place was dead. She swayed slightly, and the man moved quickly, his hand coming up to steady her elbow. The touch was gentle but firm, and Victoria found herself looking up into those gray-blue eyes that now held something like concern. "When did you last eat?" he asked, his voice softer now. "This morning," Victoria lied. It had been yesterday afternoon, and even then just some dry bread she had been rationing. "Right," he said, clearly not believing her. "Come on. The boarding house is down this way, and I expect that is where you are headed anyway. Mrs. Donnelly will fix you something." "How did you know about the boarding house?" Victoria asked, allowing him to pick up her trunk as though it weighed nothing. "There is only one boarding house in Alta," he said, starting down the street. "And Mrs. Donnelly has been running it for your aunt these past 5 years. If you are the niece from back east, then you are expected, just about 2 weeks later than planned." Victoria hurried to keep up with his long strides, her skirts kicking up dust. The trains were delayed by flooding in Kansas. "I sent word. Mail is not exactly reliable out here," he said. "Takes what it takes." They walked in silence for a moment before Victoria realized she did not even know his name. "I am Victoria Hayes," she said, "though I suppose you already guessed that." "Tanner Crawford," he replied, glancing back at her. "I run cattle on the land north of town. Your aunt was a good woman. Sorry for your loss." Victoria felt a pang of guilt. She had never met her aunt, had not even known of her existence until the lawyer's letter arrived. Her father had been estranged from his sister for decades, some old family quarrel that had never been explained. When her parents died of influenza last winter, Victoria had been left alone with debts she could not pay and a landlord who had made his interest in alternative payment arrangements clear enough that she had packed what she could carry and left in the night. The letter about the inheritance had arrived at her friend's address just as she was contemplating options she did not want to contemplate. "I did not know her," Victoria admitted quietly. Tanner looked at her more carefully then, and she saw understanding flicker across his face. Running from something, that look said. It made her defensive and grateful in equal measure. The boarding house turned out to be a two-story structure that was in considerably better repair than most of the other buildings in town. The paint was faded but intact, and flowers grew in boxes beneath the windows, a splash of color in the brown landscape. Tanner set her trunk on the porch and knocked twice before opening the door himself. "Mrs. Donnelly, you have a visitor," he called out. A woman emerged from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes traveled over Victoria, taking in the travel-worn dress, the too thin frame and the careful composure that was starting to crack. "Lord have mercy, you are just a baby," Mrs. Donnelly said, but her voice was kind. Come in, come in. You look ready to drop." "I will leave you to it," Tanner said, already backing toward the door. "Miss Hayes." "Wait," Victoria said quickly. "Thank you for your help." He nodded, something warming in his eyes, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. "Mrs." Donnelly bustled her into the kitchen and sat her down at a scarred wooden table that had clearly seen years of use. Within minutes, Victoria had a bowl of stew in front of her, bread still warm from the oven, and a cup of coffee strong enough to strip paint. She tried to eat slowly to maintain her dignity, but her hunger won out and she devoured everything. "Better," Mrs. Donnelly said, sitting across from her with her own cup of coffee. "Now let us talk practical matters. Your aunt left you this place free and clear. No debts, no liens. There are 4 rooms upstairs for boarders and 2 down here for us. I have been keeping things running and taking a wage from the proceeds. We have 3 steady boarders right now and usually get travelers through on the stage twice a week." Victoria set down her spoon, her mind racing. "You have been managing everything." "Someone had to," Mrs. Donnelly said. "Your aunt had a stroke, God rest her. She went quick, but she had time to tell me to keep the place going until you arrived. She seemed to know you would come, though I do not know how." "I did not know I would come," Victoria said honestly. "Not until I had nowhere else to go." Mrs. Donnelly reached across the table and patted her hand. "Sometimes the best destinations are the ones we do not choose. Now you are exhausted. Let me show you to your room, and you can decide tomorrow what you want to do about all this." The room was small but clean, with a bed that looked like heaven after weeks of sleeping sitting up on trains and stage coaches. Victoria barely managed to remove her boots before she collapsed onto the mattress and fell into a sleep so deep it was almost like death. She woke to early morning light streaming through lace curtains and the smell of bacon frying. For a moment she could not remember where she was, but then it all came back in a rush. Wyoming, Alta, the boarding house, Tanner Crawford's gray-blue eyes. Victoria dressed quickly in her other dress, which was hardly in better condition than the one she had traveled in, and went downstairs to find the kitchen already bustling. Mrs. Donnelly was at the stove, and 3 men sat at the table eating breakfast. They looked up as she entered, and all 3 immediately stood, removing their hats. "Morning, miss," the oldest one said. He had gray in his beard and kind eyes. "I am Frank Morris. These are Sam Chen and David Porter. We board here." "Good morning," Victoria said, feeling awkward under their scrutiny. "Please sit. I did not mean to interrupt." "You are not interrupting," Mrs. Donnelly said firmly. "You own the place. Now sit and eat." The meal was surprisingly comfortable. The men were respectful and seemed genuinely pleased to meet her. Frank worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town. Sam ran the laundry, a business he had built from nothing after coming to Wyoming from California 5 years ago. David was a cowhand who worked for various ranches, wherever the work took him. "Crawford place most recently," David said when asked. "Tanner runs a good operation. Fair wages, decent conditions. He is young to be running a spread that size, but his father trained him well before he passed." Victoria found herself curious despite her better judgment. "How long has Mr. Crawford been running the ranch?" 3 years now," Frank said. "Since he was about 22. His father died in a riding accident, left him the whole operation. Some thought he would sell, being so young, but he dug in and made it work. Respected man in these parts." Victoria filed that information away, though she was not sure why it mattered. She had larger concerns. After breakfast, Mrs. Donnelly showed her the account books, and Victoria spent the morning trying to understand the financial situation she had inherited. The boarding house made a modest profit, enough to support 2 people comfortably if they were careful. The rooms upstairs were clean and well maintained. There was a small parlor for the boarders and a separate sitting room that had been her aunt's private space. "Did she have friends?" Victoria asked, looking at the books in the sitting room, the knitting left in a basket. "The whole town," Mrs. Donnelly said. "Your aunt was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up with food when someone was sick. People will be wanting to meet you, pay their respects." Victoria felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. She had never been good at social niceties, had always been too bookish, too serious. Her mother had despaired of her ever making a good match, and her father had been content to let her help with his accounting business rather than push her toward marriage. Now both were gone, and she was supposed to fill the shoes of a beloved aunt she had never met. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning and cooking and learning the routines of the boarding house. Mrs. Donnelly was a patient teacher, and Victoria was a quick study. By evening, she was exhausted but felt a small sense of accomplishment. She had survived her first full day in Alta, Wyoming. Tanner Crawford appeared on the porch just as she was taking a moment to catch her breath in the cooling evening air. He was leading his horse, a handsome bay gelding, and looked like he had been working hard all day. Dust covered his clothes, and there was a smudge of dirt on his jaw. "Evening, Miss Hayes," he said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Thought I would check in, see how you are settling." "Well enough," Victoria said, surprised by how glad she was to see him. "Though I confess everything feels rather overwhelming." "It will," Tanner said. "New place, new situation. Give it time." They stood in silence for a moment, and Victoria found herself studying him in the fading light. There was something solid about him, something steady that made her feel less adrift. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Tanner seemed surprised too, but he smiled, and it transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip. "I would like that." He tied his horse to the rail and followed her inside. "Mrs. Donnelly raised an eyebrow when they entered the kitchen but said nothing. simply poured 2 cups of coffee and then made herself scarce. Victoria sat at the table and Tanner sat across from her, cradling the cup in his calloused hands. "How bad was it?" he asked quietly. "Back east." Victoria looked up sharply. "What makes you think it was bad?" "The look in your eyes when you arrived," Tanner said. "I have seen it before. People come west for opportunity, but they also come west to escape. Nothing wrong with that." Victoria considered lying, but something about his direct gaze made her want to tell the truth. "My parents died. Left debts. The landlord wanted payment I could not give, but he was willing to negotiate terms I could not accept. When the letter came about the inheritance, I took what I could carry and left." Tanner's jaw tightened. "He threatened you." "In a manner of speaking," Victoria said, "but I am here now and he is there, and that is all that matters." "You are safe here," Tanner said, and it sounded like a promise. "Alta looks after its own." "I am not one of Alta's own," Victoria said. "I am a stranger who inherited a building." "You are Eleanor Hayes's niece," Tanner said. "That makes you family to half this town. Your aunt delivered most of the babies born here in the last 10 years. She nursed people through sickness, mediated disputes, and kept this boarding house as a safe harbor for anyone who needed it. You carry her name now. People will give you a chance to prove yourself worthy of it." The weight of that expectation pressed down on Victoria's chest. "What if I cannot? What if I am nothing like her? Then you will be yourself, and that will have to be enough," Tanner said simply. He finished his coffee and stood. "I should go. Early start tomorrow." Victoria walked him to the door, and on the porch he paused, looking down at her in the darkness. "If you need anything, my place is about 5 miles north. Just follow the main road. Anyone in town can give you directions." "Thank you," Victoria said, "for everything." He nodded and swung up onto his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. She watched him ride away until the darkness swallowed him, then went back inside to find Mrs. Donnelly watching her with a knowing smile. "That is a good man," Mrs. Donnelly said. "I barely know him," Victoria protested. "Give it time," Mrs. Donnelly said, echoing Tanner's earlier words. "Give it time." The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm. Victoria woke early, helped prepare breakfast for the boarders, cleaned rooms, did laundry, helped with dinner, and fell into bed exhausted each night. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done back east, but there was something satisfying about it. She could see the results of her labor in clean sheets and good meals and the grateful smiles of the men who boarded there. The town slowly revealed itself to her. Alta was small, maybe 300 people, serving the ranches and homesteads scattered across the surrounding territory. There was the general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that also served as a gathering place, a small church that held services every Sunday, the marshal's office, and a handful of other businesses clinging to existence. The railroad did not come through Alta, which was both a curse and a blessing. It meant isolation, but also a certain protection from the kind of rapid, violent growth that plagued other frontier towns. People were curious about her, but they were also kind. Women brought by pies and introduced themselves. Men tipped their hats when she walked to the general store. The marshal, a weathered man named Tom Bishop, came by to officially inform her that the property was indeed hers, and that if she had any trouble, she should come to him immediately. "Your aunt had a way of attracting strays," Marshal Bishop said, his tone suggesting this was both a compliment and a warning. "People down on their luck, running from something, needing a fresh start. She gave them a place to land. Just be careful. Not everyone deserves the benefit of the doubt." Victoria promised to be cautious, though she privately thought that she herself was exactly the kind of stray the marshal was warning her about. Tanner came by the boarding house several times over those 2 weeks, always with some excuse. He needed to speak with David about work. He was returning a book Mrs. Donnelly had loaned him. He wanted to drop off some fresh beef as a thank you for a meal. Each time, he and Victoria would end up talking, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour. She learned that he had been born in Texas, moved to Wyoming with his parents when he was 12, loved the land with a fierce devotion that she found both foreign and fascinating. He learned that she had taught herself bookkeeping by helping her father, that she loved to read, that she missed the ocean even though she had only seen it a handful of times. "I would like to see the ocean," Tanner said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "But I do not think I could ever leave here for good. This land gets into your blood." "I feel like I barely understand it," Victoria admitted. "It is so empty, so harsh." "It is not empty," Tanner said. "It is full. You just have to learn to see what is there. The way the grass moves in the wind, the shape of the clouds, the stars at night so bright you feel like you could reach up and grab them." He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes intense. "I could show you, if you wanted, the ranch, the land, help you understand it better." Victoria's heart beat faster. "That would be improper." "Bring Mrs. Donnelly as a chaperone," Tanner said, "or I could arrange for a group. Some of the other ranchers' wives are always looking for social occasions. I just thought you might want to see more of your new home." Victoria found herself wanting to say yes more than she had wanted anything in a long time. "I would like that." They arranged it for the following Sunday after church. Victoria wore her better dress, which was still worn but at least not stained from travel. Mrs. Donnelly came with her, as did two other women from town, Sarah Mitchell and her sister Emma, whose family ran the general store. Tanner had a wagon ready, and another cowhand, a young man named Jack, drove it while Tanner rode alongside on his bay gelding. The Crawford Ranch was a revelation. The house was a solid two-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch and windows that caught the light. There were barns and corrals, and cattle dotting the hills as far as Victoria could see. Tanner showed them around with obvious pride, explaining how his father had built it all from nothing, how they were trying new breeding techniques, how the spring water situation was tricky but manageable. Victoria found herself fascinated not just by the ranch, but by Tanner himself. He came alive out here, his face animated as he talked about calving season and grazing patterns and the constant challenge of weather. This was a man who had found his purpose, his place in the world, and she felt a pang of envy for that certainty. After the tour, they had lunch on the porch, food that Tanner's housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Peterson, had prepared. The conversation flowed easily, and Victoria felt herself relaxing in a way she had not since arriving in Wyoming. Mrs. Donnelly and the Mitchell sisters clearly approved of Tanner, and they made sure to mention more than once what a catch he would be for any sensible woman. Tanner bore their teasing with good humor, but Victoria noticed the way his eyes kept finding hers, the way he smiled when she laughed at something Mrs. Mitchell said. There was an attraction there, undeniable and growing stronger each time they met. On the way back to town, the wagon hit a deep rut in the road and Victoria was thrown against Mrs. Donnelly. Tanner was off his horse in an instant, his hands reaching up to steady her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his face close to hers, concern evident in every line. "I am fine," Victoria said, though her heart was racing from more than just the jolt. Just startled. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Sorry about that. This road gets rough in places." That night, lying in bed, Victoria admitted to herself what she had been trying to ignore. She was falling for Tanner Crawford. It was foolish, impractical, and completely beyond her control. She barely knew him. She barely knew herself anymore. This new version of herself that cooked and cleaned and lived in Wyoming instead of Philadelphia. But when he looked at her with those gray-blue eyes, when he smiled at something she said, when he talked about the land with such passion, she felt something shift inside her, something that felt dangerously like hope. The question was what to do about it. Victoria had no experience with courtship. Her parents had been planning to arrange a suitable match when they died, but she had been content to wait, to focus on her books and her father's business. Now she was in a place where the rules were different, where a woman could own property and run a business, where maybe she could choose for herself. The next time Tanner came by the boarding house, Victoria was hanging laundry in the side yard. He dismounted and came over to help her, taking the wet sheets and hanging them on the line with practiced efficiency. "You do not have to do that," Victoria said, flustered. "Many hands make light work," Tanner said. "Besides, I wanted to talk to you." Victoria's stomach flipped. "About what?" Tanner secured a sheet with a clothespin before turning to face her. "There is a dance next Saturday night, at the church. The whole town will be there. I was hoping you might save me a dance, or several." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am not much of a dancer." "Neither am I," Tanner admitted. "But it is tradition, and it would give me an excuse to spend time with you without half the town watching from windows." Victoria laughed at that because it was true. She had noticed the way people observed her and Tanner, the speculative looks and knowing smiles. "All right, I will save you a dance. And maybe a walk afterward," Tanner asked, his voice softer now. "There are things I would like to say to you, Victoria, things that should not be said in public." Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The week until the dance crawled by. Victoria found herself thinking about Tanner at odd moments, remembering the way his hands had felt on her waist, the sound of his laugh, the intensity of his gaze. Mrs. Donnelly noticed her distraction and smiled but said nothing, which somehow made it worse. When Saturday finally arrived, Victoria spent far too long getting ready. Her dress options were limited, but Mrs. Donnelly helped her press and mend her best one, a dark blue silk that had been her mother's and still fit reasonably well. She pinned up her hair, trying several different styles before settling on one that felt both elegant and practical. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Donnelly said, standing back to survey her work. "He will not be able to take his eyes off you." The church was transformed for the dance. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the space. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and a small group of musicians was setting up in the corner. It seemed like the entire town had turned out, dressed in their best and ready for an evening of entertainment. Tanner was already there when Victoria arrived, and Mrs. Donnelly was right. His eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He crossed the room to her side, ignoring everyone else. "You look stunning," he said quietly, his voice rough. "Thank you," Victoria said, suddenly shy. "You look very handsome yourself." He did. He wore a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that fit him perfectly. His hair was still damp from washing, and he had shaved recently. He looked like a man who had taken care with his appearance, and Victoria felt a thrill at the thought that it might be for her. The music started, and couples began to move onto the makeshift dance floor. Tanner offered his hand, and Victoria took it, letting him lead her into a simple waltz. He had been wrong about not being a good dancer. He moved with the same natural grace he showed on horseback, and Victoria found it easy to follow his lead. They danced 3 times in a row before propriety demanded they separate and dance with others. Victoria found herself partnered with David, then with Sam Chen. then with Marshall Bishop, who danced with stiff formality. But her eyes kept finding Tanner across the room, and each time she looked, he was already looking back. Finally, after what felt like hours, Tanner appeared at her side again. "Walk with me," he asked. Victoria nodded, and they slipped out the side door into the cool night air. The music followed them, muffled now by distance and walls. Tanner led her away from the church, toward a small grove of cottonwood trees that grew near the creek. "I have been thinking about how to say this," Tanner said, stopping under the trees and turning to face her. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, dappling his face with shadow and light. "But I do not think there is a right way, so I am just going to speak plainly." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. "All right. End your journey here," Tanner said, his voice intense. "Stop looking for whatever you thought you would find somewhere else. Stay in Alta. Stay with me." Victoria stared at him, her mind racing. "Tanner, we have only known each other a few weeks." "I know," he said. "And I know this is not how things are supposed to be done. I am supposed to court you properly for months, maybe a year. I am supposed to be cautious and sensible. But Victoria, I have felt more alive in the last few weeks than I have in the 3 years since my father died. When I am with you, I remember what it is like to want something beyond just surviving the next season. You make me want to build something bigger than myself." "You barely know me," Victoria whispered, though her heart was singing. "I know that you are brave," Tanner said, stepping closer. "You left everything familiar and traveled across the country alone to an uncertain future. I know that you are kind. I have watched you with Mrs. Donnelly, with the boarders, with the people in town. You treat everyone with respect and compassion. I know that you are strong. You could have given up a dozen times, but you keep pushing forward. I know that you make me laugh, that you challenge me, that when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a long winter." He reached up and gently cupped her face with his hand. "I know that I am falling in love with you, and I think you might be falling for me too." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "I am," she admitted. "I did not want to, I did not plan to, but I am." "Then stay," Tanner said. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because of the boarding house or any other practical reason. Stay because you want to see where this goes. Stay because when you think about your future, maybe you can see me in it." "I can," Victoria said, and the truth of it washed over her like a wave. This man, this place, this life she was building from nothing, it felt right in a way nothing had felt right in a very long time. "I can see you in it." Tanner smiled, and then he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft and sweet at first, a gentle press of lips, but then Victoria wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made her whole body hum with awareness. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "So you will stay?" Tanner asked, his forehead resting against hers. "I will stay," Victoria said. "I will end my journey here." They stayed under the cottonwood trees for a long time, talking quietly about the future, about what it might look like. Tanner wanted to court her properly, wanted to do things right despite his impulsive declaration. Victoria agreed, though she felt like her heart had already decided everything important. When they finally returned to the dance, Mrs. Donnelly took one look at their faces and smiled so wide it looked like her face might split. The next few months unfolded like a dream. Tanner came to town whenever he could spare time from the ranch. They took walks together, always chaperoned by Mrs. Donnelly or one of the other town women. They sat on the boarding house porch and talked until the stars came out. Tanner brought her small gifts, a book he thought she might like, a pretty stone he found by the creek, wildflowers picked from the meadow. Victoria threw herself into making the boarding house more than just a place to sleep. She started serving dinners to anyone in town who wanted to come, creating a community gathering space. She began offering reading lessons to some of the children whose parents could not afford formal schooling. She joined the Church Ladies' Aid Society and helped organize fundraisers for families in need. The town took notice. She heard people comparing her to her aunt, saying a leaner would have been proud. Slowly, Victoria stopped feeling like an imposter and started feeling like she belonged. Winter came to Wyoming with a vengeance, howling winds and snow that piled in drifts against the buildings. The boarding house became a refuge, warm and welcoming against the brutal cold. Tanner came to town less frequently, the demands of keeping his cattle alive through the harsh weather consuming most of his time and energy. But when he did come, Victoria saw the exhaustion in his face, the weight of responsibility he carried. "Let me help," she said one evening when he had come by after 3 weeks away. He looked like he had not slept in days, his eyes red-rimmed and his face gaunt. "You cannot help with this," Tanner said, his voice rough. "We are losing cattle. The snow is too deep and the cold is unrelenting. I am doing everything I can, but it might not be enough." Victoria took his hands in hers. They were chapped and raw from the cold and the work. "Then let me help with something else. Stay here tonight, sleep in a real bed, eat a real meal. You cannot save your ranch if you work yourself to death." Tanner wanted to argue, she could see it in his eyes, but his exhaustion won out. "Just for tonight." Mrs. Donnelly set him up in one of the spare rooms, and Victoria brought him food and hot coffee. He ate mechanically, barely tasting anything, and then fell into bed fully clothed and slept for 14 hours straight. When he woke, there was color back in his face and clarity in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, finding Victoria in the kitchen. "I needed that more than I realized." "You cannot do everything alone," Victoria said gently. "Even the strongest person needs help sometimes." Tanner pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You are right. I am just not used to having someone to lean on." "Well, get used to it," Victoria said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Because I am not going anywhere." The winter felt endless, but eventually the snow began to melt, and green shoots pushed up through the mud. Tanner had lost cattle, but not as many as some. The ranch would survive, would even thrive with the plans he had for the coming year. As spring arrived, he started coming to town more often again, and Victoria saw the life returning to him, the weight lifting from his shoulders. One evening in early April, Tanner asked her to walk with him. Mrs. Donnelly watched them go with her knowing smile, and several of the boarders exchanged significant looks. Victoria knew what was coming before Tanner said a word. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the nervous energy in his movements. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant pinks and purples. Tanner stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Victoria Hayes," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "I love you. I have loved you since that first day when you stood alone in the street looking lost and scared and determined. I love your strength and your kindness and your intelligence. I love the way you have made Alta your home, the way you have built a life here. I love how you make me want to be better, to do more, to dream bigger." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I know I am just a cowboy running a ranch that might fail in any given year. I know I cannot offer you the kind of life you might have had back east, but I can offer you my whole heart, my complete devotion, and a partnership built on love and respect. Will you marry me?" Victoria felt tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, absolutely yes." Tanner stood and slipped the ring onto her finger. It was simple, a single small diamond on a gold band, but to Victoria, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Then he kissed her, and she tasted salt from her tears mixing with the sweetness of the moment. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church, with the whole town in attendance. Victoria wore a dress that Mrs. Donnelly and the other women had helped her make, soft ivory cotton with lace at the collar and sleeves. Tanner wore a new suit that he was clearly uncomfortable in, but he looked so handsome that Victoria could hardly breathe when she saw him standing at the altar. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Marshal Bishop gave Victoria away, standing in as the closest thing she had to family. Mrs. Donnelly cried through the entire service. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Tanner kissed her, the whole congregation erupted in applause. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night. There was food and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. Victoria danced with Tanner with the boarders with Marshal Bishop and half the men in town. Her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling, but she had never been happier. As the evening wound down, Tanner pulled her aside. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Home." The word sent a thrill through her. Not the boarding house, though that would always hold a special place in her heart. Home was the ranch, the house Tanner had been preparing for her arrival, the life they would build together. They rode out under the stars, Tanner's horse pulling a small buggy that held Victoria and her few possessions. The night was cool but not cold, and the sky was so full of stars that it took her breath away. "You were right," Victoria said, looking up at the brilliant display. "About the stars." "They are amazing." "They are," Tanner agreed, "but not as amazing as you," Victoria laughed, feeling giddy and young and full of joy. "That was terrible, absolutely terrible." "But true," Tanner said, grinning at her. "I might not be good at flowery words, Victoria, but I will spend every day showing you how much you mean to me." The ranch house was lit up when they arrived, lanterns glowing in the windows. Mrs. Peterson had prepared everything, leaving food and fresh flowers and a note welcoming them home before discreetly retiring to her own cottage on the property. Tanner lifted Victoria down from the buggy, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her up the steps and over the threshold. "Tradition," he said when she laughed. "Some things are worth keeping." That first night as husband and wife was tender and nervous and wonderful. They learned each other in the darkness, whispered words and soft touches building into something more. When Victoria woke in the morning to find Tanner beside her, his face peaceful in sleep, she felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Victoria had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, so different from running the boarding house. There were early mornings and long days, cattle drives and brandings, endless work that left her exhausted. But there was also beauty in it, in watching a foal take its first steps, in the satisfaction of a good hay crop, in sitting on the porch with Tanner at the end of a hard day, and feeling like they had accomplished something meaningful together. They worked side by side, Victoria keeping the books and managing the household while Tanner handled the cattle and the land. They learned to communicate, to navigate disagreements, to support each other through difficulties. It was not always easy, but it was always worthwhile. Mrs. Donnelly continued to run the boarding house in town with Victoria's blessing, keeping the profits to support herself and maintain the property. Victoria visited often, staying connected to the community that had welcomed her. She and Tanner hosted dinners at the ranch, building friendships with the neighboring ranchers and their families. In the late fall, Victoria realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week, then another, before finally admitting to herself what might be happening. When she told Tanner, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, his face alight with joy. "A baby," he said, setting her down gently like she might break. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy was harder than Victoria expected. She was sick for months, barely able to keep anything down. Tanner hovered anxiously, driving her slightly mad with his concern. But eventually the sickness passed, and she began to bloom, her belly growing round with their child. The baby came in early June of 1880, after a long and difficult labor that left Victoria exhausted but exhilarated. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with a shock of dark hair like his father and gray-blue eyes that would later change to brown. They named him Thomas, after Tanner's father, and called him Tommy. Tanner was besotted from the first moment, holding the tiny bundle with such tenderness that Victoria fell in love with him all over again. He was a devoted father, taking Tommy with him on the ranch when he could, teaching him about the land and the animals even when he was too young to understand. Victoria settled into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. She was tired constantly, overwhelmed often, but deeply happy. This was the family she had dreamed of without realizing she was dreaming, the home she had been searching for without knowing she was lost. 2 years later, another baby came, a girl they named Sarah after Tanner's mother. She was quieter than Tommy had been, with Victoria's dark eyes and thoughtful expression. Tommy was fascinated by his little sister, wanting to help with everything. The ranch prospered as the years passed. Tanner's innovations and hard work paid off, and they were able to expand, buying additional land and increasing their herd. They built onto the house, adding more bedrooms for the growing family and a proper office for Victoria to manage the books. In 1884, Victoria convinced Tanner to diversify. She had been reading about agricultural trends and believed that relying solely on cattle was risky. They added chickens, pigs, and a large vegetable garden. Victoria started selling eggs and produce in town, building relationships with the other merchants. The additional income streams helped them weather the inevitable fluctuations in cattle prices. Their third child, a son they named Daniel, was born in 1885. He was a sunny, easy baby who rarely fussed and seemed content to observe the world with calm interest. With 3 children under the age of 7, the house was chaotic and loud and full of life. Mrs. Donnelly sold the boarding house in 1886, deciding she was ready to retire. She moved into a small cottage on the Crawford ranch, becoming an honorary grandmother to the children and a beloved presence in their daily lives. Victoria was grateful for her wisdom and her help, especially as the demands of managing a growing family and a thriving ranch sometimes felt overwhelming. One evening, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Victoria and Tanner sat on the porch as they had done countless times before. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "You ever regret it?" Tanner asked quietly. "Staying here, giving up whatever life you might have had back east," Victoria lifted her head to look at him. "Not for a single moment. That life was not living, Tanner. It was just surviving, waiting for something I could not even name. This is living. This ranch, this family, you. This is everything I never knew I wanted. You gave me everything," Tanner said, his voice rough with emotion. "A family, a partner, a reason to build something lasting. I was just going through the motions before you arrived. Working the ranch because it was what I was supposed to do, but not really thinking about the future. You changed that. You changed everything." Victoria kissed him, soft and sweet, a reaffirmation of all the promises they had made to each other. "We changed everything together." As the years continued to pass, the Crawford Ranch became known throughout Wyoming for its quality cattle and progressive management. Tanner and Victoria became respected members of the community, known for their generosity and fairness. They hosted barn raisings, contributed to the church, and helped neighbors in need. The children grew strong and capable. Tommy loved the ranch as much as his father did, following Tanner everywhere and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Sarah inherited her mother's love of books and her quick mind, often found curled up reading when she should have been doing chores. Daniel was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, with a gift for working with the animals. In 1890, Victoria started a small school on the ranch, teaching not just her own children but several of the neighboring families' children as well. She had always loved learning and found joy in passing that love on to the next generation. The school met 3 days a week in a room they added to the house specifically for that purpose. Tanner watched her teach with evident pride. "My brilliant wife," he would say, stealing a kiss when the children were not looking. "Is there anything you cannot do?" "Plenty," Victoria would reply, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in how her life had unfolded. The scared, desperate girl who had arrived in Alta 12 years ago seemed like a different person, someone from another lifetime. Their fourth and final child, a daughter named Alina after Victoria's aunt, was born in 1891. She was a surprise, coming 7 years after Daniel when they thought their family was complete. But she was a welcome surprise, a joyful addition who brought laughter and light into their home. Mrs. Donnelly passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1893. The whole town mourned her, and Victoria grieved deeply for the woman who had been like a mother to her. They buried her in the small cemetery near the church, and Victoria made sure fresh flowers were always on her grave. As the century drew toward its close, Victoria sometimes reflected on the twisting path that had brought her to Wyoming. The desperate flight from Philadelphia, the uncertainty and fear of those early days, the moment when Tanner had asked her to end her journey in Alta. If someone had told her then how her life would unfold, she would not have believed them. The happiness felt too big, too complete to be real, but it was real. Every morning when she woke up beside Tanner, every evening when they gathered around the dinner table with their children, every moment of laughter and struggle and triumph, it was all gloriously, beautifully real. Tommy was 18 now, practically running the ranch alongside his father. He had grown into a fine young man, tall and strong, with Tanner's work ethic and Victoria's sharp mind. Sarah was 16, preparing to attend a teaching college in Denver, determined to get a formal education and bring new knowledge back to their community. Daniel, at 14, had announced his intention to become a veterinarian, already demonstrating an almost magical ability to calm frightened animals. And little Alina, at 8 years old, was still their wild child, fearless and curious about everything. Tanner had gray at his temples now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Victoria had lost the rail, thin figure of her youth, her body changed by childbearing and hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love in this harsh, beautiful land. One summer evening in 1899, as they celebrated 20 years of marriage with a gathering of friends and neighbors, Victoria stood on the porch of their home and looked out at the assembled crowd. She saw people who had become family, children who had grown up alongside her own, a community that had embraced her when she had nothing. Tanner came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. "Deliriously," Victoria said, leaning back against him. "Though if you had told me 21 years ago when I stepped off that stagecoach that this would be my life, I would have thought you were insane. And yet here we are," Tanner said, kissing her temple. "Thank God you listened when I asked you to stay. Thank God you asked." Victoria replied. They watched the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that never failed to take Victoria's breath away. 21 years in Wyoming, and the beauty of it still surprised her. The land that had seemed so empty and harsh had revealed itself to be full of life and possibility, just as Tanner had promised it would. The party continued around them, music and laughter floating on the evening air. Their children danced with their friends. Mrs. Peterson served food with the help of several young women from town. Marshall Bishop, now retired but still a familiar presence, told stories from the old days to anyone who would listen. This was her life now. Not the one she had planned, not the one she had been raised to expect, but the one she had found when she was at her lowest point. She had been traveling alone to uncertain prospects, running from a past that offered nothing but despair. And then a cowboy with gray-blue eyes had essentially told her to end her journey in Alta, and she had been brave enough or desperate enough or wise enough to listen. "I love you," Victoria said, turning in Tanner's arms to face him. "I have loved you for 21 years, and I will love you until I draw my last breath." "And I love you," Tanner said, his voice thick with emotion. "My Victoria, my heart, my home." He kissed her then in front of everyone, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Tommy groaned good-naturedly about his parents being embarrassing. Sarah smiled softly. Daniel looked away with the particular mortification of a teenage boy watching his parents kiss. Eleanor clapped and laughed, too young yet to understand but delighted by the happiness around her. As the stars came out, brilliant and close in the clear Wyoming sky, Victoria reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. She had left Philadelphia with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter about an inheritance. She had been alone, frightened, and uncertain about her future. But she had also been strong, even if she had not known it at the time. Strong enough to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Strong enough to accept help when it was offered. Strong enough to take a chance on love when it appeared in the form of a cowboy who saw something in her worth keeping. The boarding house in town had a new owner now, a young widow with 2 children who reminded Victoria a bit of herself all those years ago. Victoria made sure to visit regularly, to offer the same kind of support and encouragement that Mrs. Donnelly had given her. She believed in paying forward the kindness that had been shown to her, in being a light for others as others had been a light for her. The Crawford Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres now, one of the most successful operations in Wyoming. But success was not measured just in land or cattle or money. It was measured in the family they had built, the community they were part of, the life they had created together through hard work and dedication and love. As the party finally wound down and guests began to head home, Tanner and Victoria walked together to check on the horses, a routine they had maintained throughout their marriage. The barn was quiet and peaceful, smelling of hay and leather and horse. They walked down the center aisle, Tanner's arm around Victoria's shoulders, her arm around his waist. 20 more years, Tanner said. At least 20 more. Maybe 40. Greedy, Victoria teased, but her heart swelled at the thought. She wanted every year she could get with this man, every day, every moment. "When it comes to you, absolutely," Tanner said without shame. "I want a lifetime and then some." They stood together in the doorway of the barn, looking out at the starlit prairie. This was their land, their legacy, their home. And it had all started with a desperate woman arriving alone in a dusty town, and a cowboy who had seen beyond her circumstances to the person she could become. Victoria thought about all the moments that had brought them here. The first time Tanner had helped her, asking nothing in return. The quiet conversations on the boarding house porch. The dance where he had asked her to stay. The proposal under the brilliant sunset. The wedding, the births of their children, the challenges overcome and the triumphs celebrated. Every moment had been a thread woven into the tapestry of their life together. "No regrets?" Tanner asked, echoing his question from years before. "Not a single one," Victoria said firmly. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be," and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The journey that had seemed so uncertain had led her to exactly the right destination. She had ended her journey in Alta, Wyoming, just as Tanner had asked, and in doing so, she had found not just a place to live but a purpose for living, not just a house but a home, not just a husband but a partner in every sense of the word. The years that followed were full and rich. Tommy took over more of the ranch operations as Tanner began to slow down, though neither man would have called it retirement. Sarah came home from college with new teaching methods and a fiancé, a quiet young man who taught mathematics. They married in 1902, in the same church where Victoria and Tanner had exchanged vows 23 years earlier. Daniel went off to veterinary school and eventually set up a practice that served ranchers throughout the region. Alina showed signs of being a gifted artist, filling notebooks with sketches of the ranch and the landscape. Grandchildren began to arrive, first from Tommy, who married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, then from Sarah. The house that Victoria and Tanner had built together rang with young voices again, and they watched their children become parents with the same mixture of pride and wonder they had felt at their own children's births. Through it all, Victoria and Tanner remained each other's touchstone. They still took evening walks when weather permitted. They still sat on the porch and talked about their days. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort and love in the familiar touch. In 1905, Victoria published a small book about her experiences coming west, about the boarding house and the community of Alta and the life she had built. It was not a bestseller, but it sold well enough in Wyoming and the surrounding territories, and she received letters from other women who had made similar journeys, who had also found home in unexpected places. Tanner read the book with tears in his eyes. "You made our life sound like an adventure," he said. "It was an adventure," Victoria replied. "It is an adventure. Every day with you has been an adventure." As they moved into their 60s, both Victoria and Tanner slowed down, letting the younger generation take over more of the work. But they remained active in the community, respected elders whose advice was sought on everything from cattle breeding to settling disputes. Victoria still taught occasionally, and Tanner still rode out to check on the cattle, though not as far or as often as he once had. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919 with another big gathering. All 4 of their children were there, along with their spouses and children. The ranch house overflowed with family, 3 generations of Crawfords filling every room. Victoria looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had been given. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Victoria and Tanner sat on the porch one more time, wrapped in blankets against the spring chill. The stars were as bright as ever, the prairie stretching dark and limitless before them. 40 years, Victoria said softly. "It seems impossible. It feels like yesterday you were asking me to stay and also like it has been forever." "Best decision I ever made," Tanner said, his voice raspy with age now but still warm. "Asking you. Best decision you ever made, saying yes." "I had good instincts," Victoria said, snuggling closer to his warmth. "I saw a good man and I was smart enough to hold on." "We were both smart," Tanner said. "And lucky. So damn lucky." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes after decades of companionship. There was no need to fill every moment with words when their hearts spoke the same language. You remember that first day? Victoria asked. When I got off the stagecoach and stood there feeling so lost, I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, Tanner said. Standing there with your head up, refusing to show how scared you were. I remember thinking someone should help you, and then thinking that someone should probably be me. Thank God it was you, Victoria said. Thank God you let me, Tanner replied. As they finally headed inside to bed, walking slowly now with the careful steps of age, Victoria felt the same contentment she had felt for 40 years. This life, this man, this journey from alone and uncertain to surrounded by love and filled with purpose, it was everything. The years continued their steady march. Victoria and Tanner celebrated their 45th anniversary, then their 50th. By then, they were great-grandparents, watching the fourth generation of Crawfords begin to make their mark on the ranch and the world. Tanner's health began to fail in 1929. He fought it with characteristic stubbornness, refusing to slow down despite Victoria's worried nagging. But eventually, he had to admit that his body was wearing out, that the years of hard work and harsh weather had taken their toll. They moved to a smaller house on the property, a cottage that required less maintenance and was easier to manage. Tommy and his family took over the main house, running the ranch with capable efficiency. Victoria spent her days reading to Tanner, writing letters to their scattered children and grandchildren, and simply being present for the man who had been her companion for more than 50 years. On a cool evening in October 1930, Tanner died peacefully in his sleep with Victoria holding his hand. He was 72 years old and he had lived a good life, a full life. But Victoria felt like a piece of her heart had been ripped away. For 51 years, he had been her partner, her love, her home. The world without him seemed impossibly empty. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all over Wyoming. Tanner had been respected and loved, known for his fairness and his generosity. The church could not hold everyone who came to pay their respects. They buried him in the cemetery overlooking the ranch, with a view of the prairie he had loved so much. Victoria stood at the graveside, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and said goodbye to the man who had changed her life with a simple request to end her journey in Alta. He had given her everything, had loved her completely, had built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. She lived for another 12 years after Tanner's death, splitting her time between the cottage and visits with her children. She wrote more, capturing the stories of the early days of Wyoming, preserving the history for future generations. She spoiled her great-grandchildren and dispensed wisdom to anyone who asked for it. She remained sharp and engaged until the very end. Victoria Hayes Crawford died in her sleep in April of 1942, 3 months shy of her 85th birthday. She was surrounded by family, her children taking turns sitting with her in her final days. Her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, Tanner," and she died with a smile on her face. They buried her next to her husband on the hill overlooking the ranch. The headstone read, "Victoria Hayes Crawford, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend." She ended her journey in Alta and found her home. The Crawford Ranch continued to thrive, passed down through the generations. Tommy's children ran it, then his grandchildren. The story of Victoria and Tanner became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder of where they came from and what their ancestors had built through hard work and dedication and love. The boarding house in town was eventually torn down, replaced by a more modern building. But a historical marker was placed on the site, commemorating Eleanor Hayes, who had run it, and her niece Victoria, who had inherited it. Alta remained small, never growing into a major city, but it persisted, a testament to the people who had refused to give up on it. The main house on the Crawford Ranch was renovated and expanded over the years, but the porch remained, the same porch where Victoria and Tanner had sat countless evenings watching the sunset. New generations of Crawford sat there, watching the same stars, walking the same land, living lives shaped by the choices of a desperate woman and a kind cowboy more than a century before. The story of their meeting became embellished over time, as family stories do. Some versions had Tanner saving Victoria from robbers. Others had her arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back. But the core remained the same. A woman traveling alone to uncertain prospects. A cowboy who saw her and decided to help. A simple invitation to stay that changed both their lives forever. The love story of Victoria and Tanner Crawford was the foundation upon which generations built their lives. It was proof that sometimes the most desperate circumstances lead to the greatest blessings. That sometimes the end of one journey is really the beginning of another. That love, when it is real and deep and true, can transform everything. And so the legacy lived on, carried forward by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who inherited not just land and cattle, but also the story of two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, who had built something lasting in a harsh and beautiful land, who had loved each other completely for more than 5 decades. The prairie remained, largely unchanged despite the passage of time. The stars still shone brilliant and close in the clear Wyoming sky. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, 2 headstones stood side by side, marking the final resting place of Victoria and Tanner Crawford, the couple whose love story had started with an uncertain arrival and a simple request to stay, and had blossomed into something that would be remembered and cherished for generations to come. Their journey had ended in Alta, Wyoming territory, in 1878 and 1879. But their story, their love, their legacy continued on, as enduring as the land itself, as bright as the stars above, as deep as the love they had shared. It was a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of taking a chance, of choosing hope over despair, of believing that even in the darkest moments, there might be light waiting just around the corner. And there, on that hill, with the wind whispering through the grass and the sun setting over the prairie in a blaze of color, their story lived on, eternal and unbroken, a reminder that sometimes the best destinations are the ones we never plan to reach, and the greatest love stories are the ones that begin with a simple invitation to stay.